Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about ancient Greece. We talk about it as if it were a single, unified entity, a cradle of democracy and philosophy, a place of marble temples and heroic epics. But the truth is, for most of its formative centuries, Greece didn't actually exist. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, often at each other's throats, speaking different dialects, worshipping local gods, and operating under wildly varied political systems, from oligarchies and tyrannies to the fledgling democracy of Athens. These weren't people who thought of themselves as Greeks in the way we might think of Americans or Germans. They were Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, Thebans, each convinced of their own superiority and often deeply suspicious of their neighbours. And yet from this chaotic, fragmented world emerged ideas, art, and institutions that have shaped Western civilization for millennia. How did a culture so politically disunited manage to produce such a coherent and enduring legacy? How did these fiercely competitive, often warring peoples forge a shared identity strong enough to resist empires, write foundational texts, and inspire countless generations? It's a paradox, a fundamental tension between fragmentation and innovation, between constant conflict and a shared, profound intellectual awakening. This isn't just a story of heroes and battles. It's the story of how a collection of squabbling villages became the intellectual bedrock of the world, often despite themselves. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. When does ancient Greece actually begin? Most people think of Athens, Sparta, the Parthenon, Socrates, but that's like starting the story of America with the Civil War. Before the classical Greeks built their shining cities and pondered the nature of reality, there was a rich, complex, and ultimately mysterious world that laid the very foundations for what was to come. A world that vanished almost completely, leaving only whispers and monumental ruins, but whose memory persisted in the deepest layers of later Greek myth and identity. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the beginning of Greece is actually a story of rediscovery, of a lost age that had to be unearthed centuries later. The narrative of ancient Greece doesn't truly begin with the Greeks themselves, but with their forgotten ancestors, the sophisticated Bronze Age civilizations that flourished on the Aegean shores and islands long before the rise of Athens. We're talking about the Minoans, centered on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaeans, who built their formidable citadels on the Greek mainland. These weren't primitive societies. By 2000 BCE, while much of Europe was still in the Stone Age, the Minoans were constructing elaborate multi-story palaces, trading across the Mediterranean, and developing a unique artistic style. Their greatest palace, Knossos, near modern Heracleion, was a sprawling complex covering over 20,000 square meters, a labyrinthine marvel of some 1,000 rooms, complete with sophisticated plumbing, light wells, and vibrant frescoes depicting bull-leaping rituals and scenes of daily life. The Minoans, flourishing from roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE, were a thalassocracy, a sea power. They didn't build massive defensive walls around their palaces or cities, a detail that blows my mind. This suggests either an unprecedented period of peace in the Aegean, or such overwhelming naval dominance that they felt utterly secure. Their script, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered, a tantalizing puzzle that holds secrets we may never unlock. Imagine a culture so advanced yet so utterly alien, their language a silent testament to a world we can only glimpse through their stunning material remains. Delicate gold jewellery, intricate pottery, and those incredible frescoes with their dynamic, almost joyful depictions of nature and ritual. They worshipped goddesses, often associated with fertility and the natural world, and their iconic double-axe symbol, the labrys, recurs throughout their art and architecture, giving us the word labyrinth from the very structure of Knossos itself. Then, around 1600 BCE, a new power began to emerge on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. Unlike the Minoans, these were a distinctly warrior culture. Their citadels, like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, were built on defensible hills, fortified with massive cyclopean walls, so named because later Greeks believed only mythical giants could have moved such enormous stone blocks. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, built around 1250 BCE, is still an awe-inspiring sight. Two massive lions carved in relief above the entrance, symbolising the power and ferocity of the rulers within. These kings, like Agamemnon of later legend, were buried in elaborate shaft graves and tholos tombs, beehive-shaped stone structures filled with spectacular grave goods, golden death masks, intricate bronze weapons and finely crafted pottery. The famous Masque of Agamemnon, though probably predating the legendary king, speaks volumes about the wealth and martial pride of these early rulers. The Mycenaeans adopted much from the Minoans, including their writing system, which they adapted into what we now call Linear B. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Linear B, unlike Linear A, was deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris and John Chadwick. What they found was revolutionary. Linear B was an early form of Greek. This proved that the Mycenaeans were, in fact, the earliest Greeks, speaking a language that would evolve into the tongue of Homer and Plato. These clay tablets, preserved by accident when the palaces burned, weren't epic poems or philosophical treatises. They were meticulous administrative records, inventories of livestock, bronze, chariots, textiles, and lists of personnel. They reveal a highly centralized, bureaucratic palace economy, where every resource was accounted for, every worker assigned a task. The Mycenaeans, much like the Minoans before them, were extensive traders. Their pottery has been found across the Mediterranean, from Egypt to Italy. They established colonies and trade outposts, facilitating a vast exchange of goods and ideas, but their dominance was short-lived. Around 1450 BCE, many Minoan sites, including Knossos, were destroyed, possibly by the Mycenaeans themselves, who then occupied Crete for a period. By 1200 BCE, however, the Mycenaean world itself was in crisis. One by one, their great citadels, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, were violently destroyed, burned to the ground. The reasons for this widespread collapse are still debated among historians. Was it internal strife, a series of devastating earthquakes, climate change leading to famine or invasion by mysterious sea peoples who swept across the eastern Mediterranean, toppling empires from the Hittites to Egypt? We don't actually know for sure, but the evidence points to a combination of factors, a perfect storm that brought an entire civilization crashing down. The consequences were profound. With the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, the complex administrative systems vanished. Writing, specifically Linear B, disappeared entirely. Long-distance trade networks collapsed. Population numbers plummeted, and people retreated to smaller, more isolated settlements. This period, from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, is known as the Greek Dark Ages. It was a time of widespread depopulation, poverty, and isolation, a profound cultural regression where literacy was lost, monumental architecture ceased, and the glories of the Bronze Age faded into distant memory. Imagine a world where the ability to read and write simply vanishes, where the knowledge of how to build grand structures is forgotten. That's what happened. Yet, even in this profound darkness, the echoes of the Bronze Age persisted. The memory of powerful kings, of heroic deeds, of a time when men fought epic wars and sailed across the wine-dark sea, was passed down through oral tradition. These were the stories that would eventually coalesce into the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, tales of Troy and Odysseus' long journey home. While these poems emerged centuries later, they are steeped in the imagery and perhaps even some of the historical memory of the Mycenaean age, a testament to the enduring power of narrative even when the material culture has crumbled to dust. And we're only getting started. The true marvel is not just that this sophisticated Bronze Age civilization existed, but that from its ashes, a completely new and even more influential culture would slowly begin to emerge, paving the way for the Greece we think we know. But that's a story for the next chapter, when we delve into the long, silent centuries of the Dark Ages and the first faint glimmer of a new dawn. The violent collapse of the Mycenaean world left a void, a dark chasm stretching across 3 centuries. We call it the Greek Dark Ages for a reason, right? Imagine a society that loses its writing, its monumental architecture, its complex administration, its trade networks, and even much of its population. It's like hitting a historical reset button, but in the most brutal way possible. Cities vanished, people scattered into smaller isolated communities, and the vibrant, interconnected Bronze Age world simply wasn't. But here's the thing about history. It rarely stays dark forever. Even in the deepest shadows, embers glow, and sometimes those embers spark a new fire. So how did a land plunged into such profound regression emerge from the darkness to become the cradle of Western civilization? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the answer isn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, almost imperceptible reawakening, culminating in what we now call the Archaic period, roughly from 800 to 100 BCE. Let's start with the Begur. After centuries of decline, something began to shift around 800 BCE. We see signs of population growth again, small villages expanding and a gradual re-establishment of local trade. It's not a sudden burst of light, but rather the first faint glimmer of a new dawn. What truly defines this period, though, and what lays the very foundation for everything we associate with ancient Greece, is the birth of the whole polis. Now, if you've heard of ancient Greece, you've heard of city-states, but calling them city-states doesn't quite capture the essence of a polis. It wasn't just a city, it was a unique, self-governing community, a political, social and religious entity that included an urban centre and its surrounding agricultural land. Think of it less as a modern city and more as a sovereign mini-nation. Each polis was fiercely independent, valuing its autarkeia, its self-sufficiency, and its eleutheria, its freedom, above almost all else. This meant they were often at each other's throats, squabbling over land or resources, but it also meant they were incubators of incredible innovation and distinct identities. Why did the polis emerge? Well, after the centralized Mycenaean kingdoms vanished, there was no overarching power structure. People needed local governance, local defense. The rugged, fragmented geography of Greece naturally lent itself to these independent communities, separated by the mountains and the sea. This is a paradox that will follow us throughout our journey. How did a culture so politically disunited, so prone to internal conflict, manage to produce such a coherent and enduring legacy? The polis is the crucible where that legacy was forged. One of the most crucial elements in this re-emergence from the Dark Ages was the reintroduction of literacy. Remember how the Mycenaean Linear B script disappeared? Well, around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks encountered the Phoenicians, a maritime trading people from the Near East. The Phoenicians had a brilliant system, a phonetic alphabet. The Greeks, ever the innovators, saw its potential and adapted it to their own language, adding vowels and creating the first true alphabet as we know it. This wasn't the clunky administrative script of Linear B. This was a versatile tool that could be learned by more people, used for everything from laws and dedications to, most importantly, poetry. And speaking of poetry, this new alphabet allowed for the preservation of the oral traditions that had been passed down through the Dark Ages. Imagine generations of bards singing tales of heroic warriors and epic journeys. Now, finally, these stories could be written down. This is how we get the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. While the historicity of the Trojan War itself is still debated, these poems became the bedrock of Greek identity. They taught the Greeks about their gods, their heroes, their values, honour, glory, loyalty, cunning, and the tragic beauty of the human condition. Homer wasn't just a storyteller, he was the educator of Greece, shaping a shared cultural consciousness that transcended the political fragmentation of the polis. Even though Athens and Sparta were rivals, they both revered Achilles and Odysseus. That's powerful, but the archaic period wasn't just about internal development. It was also a period of immense expansion. As populations grew and land became scarce, many polis faced a dilemma. Rather than constantly fighting their neighbours, they looked outwards, across the wine-dark sea. This led to a massive wave of colonisation from the mid-8th to the 6th centuries BCE. Greek settlers, often led by a founder, Oikistes, after consulting an oracle, like the famous one at Delphi, sailed off to establish new polis across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. This wasn't about building an empire in the traditional sense, like Rome would later do. These colonies were generally independent from their mother cities, metropoles from the start, though they maintained strong cultural, religious and economic ties. Think of it as a vast network of independent Greek city-states, spreading Greek language, customs, architecture and political ideas from Spain to Egypt, and along the coast of modern-day Turkey, Italy and Sicily. This led to the creation of Greater Greece, Magna Graecia, in southern Italy and Sicily, a region that would become incredibly wealthy and influential. This expansion brought immense wealth through trade, new ideas, and a broader sense of what it meant to be Greek, a Hellene, distinct from the barbarians, a term the Greeks used for anyone who didn't speak Greek. This period also saw significant political evolution within the polis. Initially, many Greek communities were ruled by kings, remnants of the old tribal structures, but as wealth grew and society became more complex, power shifted to the landed aristocracy, the best men, aristoi. These oligarchies, ruled by the few, often dominated political life. However, another crucial development was brewing: the rise of the hoplite. The hoplite was a citizen soldier, typically a farmer who could afford his own armour and weapons, a bronze shield, hoplon, spear and sword. They fought in a tight formation called a phalanx, relying on discipline and collective strength. This new style of warfare meant that the defence of the polis rested not just on the aristocrats, but on a broader segment of the population. And when ordinary citizens are literally putting their lives on the line for their community, they tend to demand a greater say in how that community is run. This shift in military power was a major catalyst for political change, eroding the absolute power of the aristocrats. In many plays, this led to periods of intense social and political strife between the aristocratic elite and the increasingly vocal common citizens. Into this volatile environment stepped figures we call tyrants. Now, when we hear tyrant today, we think of a cruel, oppressive dictator. But in archaic Greece, a tyrant was simply someone who seized power outside of constitutional means, often with popular support by appealing to the grievances of the poor or the disenfranchised. Many tyrants were actually quite good for their cities. They fostered trade, built public works, patronised the arts, and often broke the power of the old aristocracies, paving the way for more inclusive forms of government. They were often transitional figures, but crucial ones. We also see the very first stirrings of what would become democracy in Athens, with figures like Solon laying down law codes that sought to balance the rights of different social classes. And in Sparta, a unique, rigidly disciplined military society was forged, supposedly by the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, creating a system that would stand in stark contrast to Athens, but would also become one of Greece's most formidable powers. Despite the intense independence and frequent warfare between poleis, the Greeks also developed a strong sense of shared identity. They spoke variations of the same language, worshipped the same pantheon of Olympian gods, Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, etc., and shared the epic tales of Homer. They gathered at pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Delphi, where they sought advice from Apollo's oracle and competed in pan-Hellenic games, like the Olympics, which began in 7x BC. These events, held in honour of the gods, provided a common cultural space, fostering a sense of kinship that transcended local rivalries, if only temporarily. They were Hellenes, distinct from everyone else. So by 500 BC, the Greek world had been utterly transformed. From the ashes of the Dark Ages, a vibrant, dynamic and expansive civilization had emerged. The polis was firmly established as the fundamental unit of political life. Literacy had returned with a vengeance, Homeric epics had forged a common cultural identity, and Greek colonies dotted the Mediterranean. The stage was set, not just for the blossoming of democracy and philosophy, but for an epic clash that would define the very future of this unique civilization. The archaic period was the tumultuous creative crucible, preparing Greece for its golden age, for the dramatic events that would truly etch its name into the annals of history. All right, we left off with Greece, a patchwork of fiercely independent polis, having just emerged from its archaic slumber. We saw the rise of literacy, the foundational myths of Homer, the explosion of colonization, and the first whispers of democracy and disciplined militarism taking shape in places like Athens and Sparta. The stage was set, the characters were introduced, and the Poleis were flexing their newfound muscles. But history, as we know, rarely follows a neat internal progression. Sometimes a massive external force comes along and threatens to rewrite the entire script. And for the Greeks, that force was the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Persia. Imagine, if you will, the Persian Empire at the dawn of the 5th century BCE. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a sprawling, multi-ethnic behemoth that stretched from the Indus River in the east to parts of North Africa and southeastern Europe in the west. Its rulers, like Darius I and later Xerxes I, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a vast navy, and resources that would make even our modern minds boggle. They had conquered Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, you name it, and now their gaze fell upon the small, fractious, and seemingly insignificant collection of city-states clinging to the edge of the Aegean. For the Persians, these Greeks were a minor annoyance, a collection of unruly subjects on the fringe of their vast dominion, particularly the Greek cities in Ionia, modern-day Turkey, who had been absorbed into the empire. When these Ionian Greeks, tired of Persian rule, revolted around 499 BCE, they naturally appealed to their kin across the Aegean for help. Athens, still a fledgling democracy but with growing naval power, sent a small fleet. This act, this tiny spark of defiance, would ignite a conflict that would define the next century of Greek history and in many ways the course of Western civilization itself. Darius I, the great king of Persia, was furious. Not only had his Ionian subjects rebelled, but those upstart Athenians had dared to interfere. He saw it as an affront, a challenge to his imperial authority, and he vowed to make them pay. This, my friends, is where the story gets truly epic. The impossible victory, the Persian Wars, c. 499 to 479 BCE. The first Persian invasion came in 490 BCE. A massive Persian fleet, carrying tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, sailed across the Aegean and landed at Marathon, a plain about 26 miles northeast of Athens. The Athenians, outnumbered by at least 2-1, faced a choice: surrender or fight. We know the outcome, don't we? Under the brilliant generalship of Miltiades, the Athenian hoplites, fighting for their homes and their nascent democracy, launched a desperate charge. They stretched their line thin to prevent encirclement and smashed into the Persian centre, then enveloped their flanks. The result was an astonishing, almost miraculous Athenian victory. Thousands of Persians were slaughtered, while the Athenians lost only 22 men. Can you imagine the shock? The sheer audacity of it? A small Greek city-state, not even all of Greece, had defeated the seemingly invincible Persian war machine. It was a moment that forged Athenian identity, a testament to the power of citizen soldiers fighting for freedom. The famous story of the messenger, running all the way to Athens to deliver the news, shouting, "Nike!" Victory, before collapsing, might be apocryphal, but the spirit it embodies is absolutely real. This wasn't the end, though. Darius died, but his son Xerxes I inherited his father's wrath and his ambition. For 10 years, Xerxes meticulously prepared, gathering an army and navy of unprecedented scale, an invasion force so vast that Herodotus claimed it drank rivers dry as it marched. This was not just a punitive expedition. This was an attempt to utterly subjugate Greece, to make it another satrapy of the Persian Empire. In 480 BCE, Xerxes launched his invasion. The Greeks, despite their fierce independence, finally understood the existential threat. Led by Sparta's land forces and Athens' naval power, a pan-Hellenic alliance was forged. We all know the story of Thermopylae, don't we? King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 Spartans, along with a few thousand other Greeks, held a narrow pass against the entire Persian army for 3 glorious days. They knew it was a suicide mission, but their sacrifice bought precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare, and more importantly, it became an enduring symbol of courage, defiance, and the Spartan ideal of fighting to the last man. It's a detail that even now gives me goosebumps. While Leonidas and his men fell, the Athenian statesman Themistocles, a strategic genius, had convinced the Athenians to abandon their city and put their faith in their navy. At the Battle of Salamis, in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland, The smaller, more agile Greek triremes, under Themistocles' command, outmaneuvered and utterly annihilated the much larger Persian fleet. It was a naval triumph of epic proportions, turning the tide of the war and crippling Persian supply lines. The following year, 479 BCE, the combined Greek land forces, led by the Spartans, delivered the final blow at the Battle of Plataea, decisively defeating the remaining Persian army. The Persian wars were over. Greece, against all odds, had won. This victory wasn't just about saving Greece, it was about saving a nascent idea of freedom, of self-governance, of a culture that valued inquiry and individual expression. It preserved the possibility for the Golden Age that was about to burst forth. But it also profoundly reshaped the Greek world, elevating Polis to unprecedented power. Athens ascendant, the Golden Age and the Delian League. Among the victors, Athens emerged as the undisputed naval superpower. Their fleet had saved Greece at Salamis, and their city had been burned to the ground by the Persians, fueling a fierce determination to rebuild and assert their leadership. Immediately after the wars, Athens spearheaded the formation of the Delian League in 478 BCE. Its stated purpose was noble: to continue fighting Persia, to liberate Greek cities still under Persian rule, and to protect the Aegean from future invasions. Member Polis contributed ships or, more commonly, money to a common treasury kept on the sacred island of Delos. But as the Persian threat receded, the League began to transform. Athens, with its powerful navy, gradually turned it into an instrument of its own imperial ambitions. Contributions became tribute. Member states found it increasingly difficult to leave the League, and the treasury was eventually moved from Delos to Athens. The League's funds were used not just for defence, but for Athenian projects, including the magnificent rebuilding of the Acropolis and the construction of the Parthenon. This period, roughly from 461 to 429 BCE, is often called the Golden Age of Athens, or the Age of Pericles. Under the leadership of the brilliant statesman Pericles, Athenian democracy reached its zenith. Citizens directly participated in governance, juries were composed of hundreds of citizens, and public offices were often filled by lot, making government truly accessible. Athens became a beacon of culture, philosophy, drama, and art. Thinkers like Socrates, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, historians like Thucydides, and architects like Ictinus and Callicrates flourished. It was a period of unparalleled intellectual and artistic innovation, a dazzling display of human potential. But this golden age had a dark underbelly. Athenian power, built on the back of its empire, bred resentment among other Greek states, especially Sparta and its allies. Athens's democratic ideals at home often contrasted sharply with its imperialistic behaviour abroad, where it suppressed dissent and forced its will upon its allies. This tension, this inherent contradiction between freedom and empire, between democracy at home and tyranny abroad, was a ticking time bomb. Brother against brother, the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE. The clash was, in many ways, inevitable. It was a conflict between two fundamentally different societies and two competing visions for Greece. On one side stood Athens, a democratic naval, commercial, and outwardly expansionist power, the head of the Delian League. On the other stood Sparta, an oligarchic, land-based, militaristic, and traditionally conservative power, the leader of the Peloponnesian League. Thucydides, the great historian of this war, famously wrote that the truest cause was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. The war broke out in 431 BCE. It was not a quick, decisive conflict, but a brutal, drawn-out struggle that lasted nearly 3 decades, tearing Greece apart. We can broadly divide it into phases. The first phase, the Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus the Skeng, saw Sparta repeatedly invade Attica, ravaging Athenian farmland. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battles, retreat behind Athens' formidable long walls, which connected the city to its port Piraeus, and rely on the Athenian navy to import food and raid the Peloponnesian coast. This strategy worked militarily, but it had a devastating human cost. A terrible plague broke out in overcrowded Athens in 430 BCE, killing a quarter of the population, including Pericles himself. The loss of such a visionary leader was a huge blow to Athens. After a temporary peace, the war reignited with a vengeance. Athens, still ambitious, launched a massive expedition to Sicily in 415 BCE, hoping to conquer the wealthy Greek city of Syracuse and gain a strategic advantage. It was an audacious plan, but it ended in catastrophic failure. The entire Athenian expeditionary force, tens of thousands of men and hundreds of ships, was annihilated. It was a blow from which Athens never truly recovered. The final phase, the Decelean War, saw Sparta, now aided by Persian gold, the irony, establish a permanent fort inside Attica, further crippling Athens. The Spartan general Lysander, a brilliant naval commander, finally defeated the Athenian fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE, cutting off Athens' grain supply. Starved and exhausted, Athens surrendered in 404 BCE. The terms were harsh. Athens' long walls were torn down, its fleet was reduced to a mere 12 ships, and its democracy was replaced by a pro-Spartan oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, whose brutal rule lasted less than a year. The Peloponnesian War was a catastrophe for Greece. It left countless dead, ruined economies, and shattered the unity that had briefly emerged during the Persian Wars. It marked the end of the Athenian Golden Age and ushered in a period of instability and decline for the entire Greek world. The shifting sands of power, Spartan and Theban hegemony, c. 404-338 BCE. Sparta the victor now held the reins of power, ushering in a period known as the Spartan hegemony, but Sparta, so adept at war, proved to be a terrible imperial power. Their rigid militaristic system was ill-suited to governing a diverse collection of Greek city-states. They imposed oligarchies, demanded tribute, and were generally oppressive and unpopular. It wasn't long before other poleis chafed under Spartan rule. This led to a bewildering series of conflicts as new alliances formed and dissolved. Athens, against all odds, managed to restore its democracy and even rebuild a semblance of its naval power. But it was Thebes, a city often overshadowed by its more famous rivals, that would momentarily rise to prominence. Under the brilliant general Epaminondas, Thebes developed revolutionary new military tactics, like the oblique order, which concentrated forces on one flank to smash through enemy lines. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Epaminondas's Theban army inflicted a shocking defeat on the mighty Spartan hoplites, breaking Sparta's military dominance forever. Thebes then invaded the Peloponnese, liberated Messenia, which had been Sparta's helot-producing breadbasket for centuries, and established a brief Theban hegemony. But Thebes, like Sparta before it, struggled to maintain its power, and Epaminondas himself fell in battle at Mantinea in 302 BCE. By the mid-4th century BCE, Greece was exhausted. Decades of internecine warfare had bled the city-state's both in terms of manpower and resources. The constant squabbling, the endless cycle of shifting alliances and betrayals had left the police weak, fragmented and vulnerable. They were fiercely independent, yes, but their independence had come at a terrible price. The stage was set once again for an external power to step in, but this time it wouldn't be from the east. It would be from a region the sophisticated southern Greeks often dismissed as barbaric. A kingdom to the north that had been quietly consolidating its strength and observing the self-inflicted wounds of its southern neighbours. A new chapter and a new kind of empire was about to begin. All right, so we've left our beloved Greek city-states utterly exhausted, battered and bruised after decades of relentless self-inflicted warfare. The Peloponnesian War, then the Spartan hegemony, then Theban dominance. It was a merry-go-round of conflict, a blood-soaked game of musical chairs where the music never really stopped. Athens was a shadow of its former self, Sparta was weakened, and Thebes, after its brief moment in the sun, was also spent. The polis, that fierce, independent, glorious and utterly stubborn unit of Greek life, had proven its brilliance but also its fatal flaw, an inability to truly unite, to see beyond its own walls, even in the face of existential threats. And that, my friends, is precisely where our story takes its next dramatic turn. Because while the southern Greeks were busy tearing each other apart, squabbling over scraps of power and prestige, a new force was quietly but powerfully rising in the north. A force that the sophisticated Athenians and Spartans often dismissed, looked down upon, even considered semi-barbaric. We're talking about Macedon. Now, if you were a proud Athenian sipping wine in the agora, Macedon was probably just that rough-and-tumble kingdom to your north, full of hardy farmers, horsemen, and kings who sometimes claimed Greek ancestry, but definitely didn't speak with the proper Attic accent. They weren't poleis in the same way, not with the same democratic or oligarchic traditions. They were a kingdom, a monarchy, and to the Greeks, that often felt a bit archaic, a bit less civilized. But here's the kicker. Sometimes what looks less civilized to one culture is simply different. And in this case, it was a difference that was about to turn the entire Greek world upside down. This is where Philip enters the stage, and let me tell you, he is one of history's great unsung geniuses. Born around 382 BCE, Philip came to the throne of Macedon in 39 BC under incredibly difficult circumstances. His kingdom was weak, surrounded by the hostile tribes, and practically on the verge of collapse. It was a mess. But Philip was no ordinary king. He was a visionary, a brilliant military strategist, a cunning diplomat, and a man with an iron will. A detail that blows my mind about Philip is his formative years. He spent time as a hostage in Thebes during its brief period of ascendancy, living in the house of the great general Epaminondas. Think about that for a second. The very man who defeated Sparta, who innovated military tactics, whose strategies were revolutionary. Philip was there, watching, learning, absorbing every single lesson. It's like a future world champion boxer getting to train with the reigning champion for years before entering the ring himself. He saw firsthand the strengths and weaknesses of the Greek hoplite phalanx, the tactical innovations, the political manoeuvring. He wasn't just observing, he was internalising, and he brought all that knowledge back to Macedon. What Philip did next wasn't just brilliant, it was revolutionary. He didn't just reform the Macedonian army, he reinvented warfare itself. He took the traditional Greek phalanx, a formidable wall of shields and spears, and he supercharged it. How? With the sarissa. This wasn't just a spear, it was a ridiculously long pike, anywhere from 13 to 20 feet long. Imagine a wall of these things, bristling outwards, 5 ranks deep. The first few ranks could reach the enemy, creating an impenetrable hedgehog of death. No traditional hoplite spear could counter it. It was brutal, efficient, and utterly terrifying. But Philip didn't stop there. He understood that pure brute force wasn't enough. He created a truly combined arms military, something the Greeks hadn't seen on this scale. His infantry, the famed Macedonian phalangites, were the anvil, but then he added the hammer. His elite cavalry, the companion cavalry, heavily armoured and trained to strike at the flanks of the enemy, breaking their formations after the phalanx had pinned them. He also developed light infantry, archers and siege engineers. This was a professional army trained year-round, loyal to him, and equipped with the best technology of the day. It was a military machine unlike anything the Greek world had ever faced. With this new army, Philip began to consolidate his power. He secured Macedon's borders, expanded its territory, and, crucially, gained control of rich gold and silver mines, particularly at Mount Pangaion. This gave him the financial resources to pay his professional army, to build a navy, and perhaps most importantly, to engage in extensive diplomacy and bribery. Yes, Philip was a master of the silver spears, paying off opponents, buying influence, and sowing discord among his enemies. He understood that war wasn't just fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the council chambers, in the marketplaces, and in the hearts of men. His strategy with the Greek city-states was a masterclass in calculated intervention. He didn't just march in and conquer them outright, at least not at first. Instead, he exploited their exhaustion and their eternal squabbles. He'd intervene in one conflict, ostensibly as an ally, then another. He'd support one faction against another, weakening both, until Macedon became the indispensable player, the arbiter of Greek affairs. The Greeks, so proud of their independence, found themselves slowly, almost imperceptibly, being drawn into Philip's web. Not everyone was blind to what was happening, of course. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes famously railed against Philip, delivering a series of passionate speeches, the Philippics, warning his fellow Athenians of the grave danger posed by the Macedonian king. He saw Philip not as a semi-barbarian, but as a cunning, relentless tyrant bent on enslaving Greece. He urged the Athenians to resist, to unite to fight for their freedom. On the other side, another Athenian orator, Socrates, argued for a different path. He saw the endless internal conflicts of the Greeks as self-destructive and believed that a strong leader like Philip could unite them, not for subjugation, but for a greater purpose, a pan-Hellenic crusade against their ancient enemy, the Persian Empire. It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? One man saw tyranny, the other saw salvation through unity. Both were, in a way, right about Philip's ambition, just not about his ultimate benevolence. The inevitable clash finally came in 328 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. By this point, Philip had pushed too far, and even the wary Athenians and Thebans realized they had to act. They formed a desperate alliance, their last gamble for independence. The combined Greek forces, including the formidable Theban sacred band, faced Philip's seasoned Macedonian army. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance on Philip's part, and a tragic end to an era for the Greeks. Philip commanded the right wing, his young son Alexander, barely 18 years old, commanded the left, leading the companion cavalry. Philip deliberately feigned a retreat on his wing, drawing the Athenian hoplites forward, breaking their disciplined line. Alexander, seeing the gap, charged the Theban sacred band, breaking their legendary formation. It was a decisive, crushing victory for Macedon. The flower of Greek hoplite warfare, the tradition of centuries, was utterly shattered by Philip's new military machine. Chaeronea wasn't just a battle, It was a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of ancient history. It marked the definitive end of the independent Greek city-state era. The polis Trooi Dorsoi. Its glory and its contributions to democracy, philosophy and art could no longer defend itself against a unified, militarily superior kingdom. The dream of true, unencumbered autonomy was over. But Philip, ever the pragmatist, wasn't interested in simply destroying Greece. He wanted to harness its power, its intellect, its culture. So he formed the League of Corinth, also known as the Hellenic League. Ostensibly, it was an alliance of Greek states, with Philip as its hegemon or leader. The terms were relatively lenient. No Macedonian garrisons in most cities, no tribute, but absolute loyalty to Philip and a commitment to provide troops for his grand design. And what was that grand design? The invasion of the Persian Empire. The dream that Socrates had preached, Philip was now ready to make a reality, uniting the Greeks under his banner against their common foe. It was a bold, audacious plan, one that would have cemented his legacy as one of history's greatest conquerors, but fate, as it often does, had other ideas. In 336 BCE, as Philip was preparing his invasion of Asia, he was assassinated. The reasons are still debated. A jilted lover, a disgruntled bodyguard, Persian agents, even whispers of Olympia's Alexander's mother, or Alexander himself. We simply don't know for sure, and that mystery adds another layer of intrigue to this incredible story. Just like that, Philip II, the man who unified Macedon, revolutionized warfare and brought the fiercely independent Greek city-states under his control, was gone. But he left behind an invincible army, a meticulously planned invasion, and a son. A son who, at just 20 years old, inherited not only his father's throne and his army, but also his ambition, his genius, and his destiny. A son named Alexander. And with Alexander's ascension, the world was about to get a whole lot bigger, and a whole lot more Greek. The stage was set for a chapter of history that would redefine empires and cultures for centuries to come. If you thought the Greeks were done making history, you were absolutely wrong. They were just getting started on a whole new scale. So there we were, standing at the precipice of an entirely new era. The formidable Philip II, architect of Macedonian dominance, struck down just as his grand vision of a pan-Hellenic invasion of Persia was about to begin. The reasons for his assassination, as we talked about, remain one of history's most tantalizing cold cases, but the immediate aftermath, that's where our story truly explodes into legend. Because Philip's 20-year-old son Alexander inherited not just a throne, but an invincible army and a dream that would reshape the known world. Now, a lot of people probably thought, oh, here we go, a young, untested king. Surely the Greeks will seize this chance to throw off the Macedonian yoke, and the Persian Empire will breathe a sigh of relief. And you know what? They tried. Almost immediately, news of Philip's death sparked rebellions across Greece. Thebes, always a thorn in Macedon's side, declared its independence. Athens, spurred on by the fiery orator Demosthenes, who openly celebrated Philip's demise, started making moves. But if these cities thought they were dealing with another callow youth, they were about to get a rude awakening. Alexander was no ordinary prince. He was tutored by Aristotle himself. Can you imagine the dinner conversations? And had already proven his mettle in battle at Chaeronea. He was brilliant, ruthless, charismatic, and possessed an almost terrifying self-belief. He moved with lightning speed, crushing the Greek revolts before they could even properly ignite. Thebes in particular paid a horrifying price. Alexander utterly destroyed the city, selling its inhabitants into slavery, sparing only the house of the poet Pindar. It was a brutal, unequivocal message. Challenge Macedon at your peril. It's a detail that chills me, honestly. but it also solidifies Alexander's reputation as a force to be reckoned with, right from the jump. With Greece subdued and his position secure, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. He assembled his forces, a combined Macedonian and Greek army, estimated at around 40,000 men, and in the spring of 384 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a symbolic act. He reportedly flung his spear into Asian soil, claiming it by right of conquest, and visited the tomb of Achilles, declaring himself a new Achilles. He was quite the showman, our Alexander. The Persian Empire, then under Darius III, was vast and wealthy, but it was also a sprawling, somewhat unwieldy behemoth compared to Alexander's lean, professional fighting machine. The satraps, provincial governors, of Asia Minor initially underestimated him, fielding local forces rather than uniting against the invader. Their first major confrontation came at the Granicus River. Alexander, leading his elite companion cavalry, plunged directly into the Persian lines, a bold, almost reckless move that shattered their resistance. It was a stunning victory, opening the path through Asia Minor. As he moved south, he encountered Gordium, where he famously untied the Gordian knot. An ancient prophecy stated that whoever could undo the complex knot would rule Asia. Alexander, ever pragmatic, simply sliced it in half with his sword. A bit of a cheat, perhaps, but it certainly got the message across. He was here to make his own rules. The next year, 333 BC, brought the Battle of Issus. This is where Alexander faced Darius III himself, leading a massive Persian army. Darius, confident in his superior numbers, positioned his forces in a narrow coastal plain, a tactical blunder that negated his numerical advantage. Alexander, with his brilliant use of cavalry and the Macedonian phalanx, executed a masterful flanking maneuver. The sight of Alexander personally leading the charge, his shield glinting, was enough to break the Persian centre. Darius III, seeing his personal guard crumble, famously fled the battlefield, leaving behind his chariot, his bow, and even his family. This was not just a victory, it was a humiliation for the King of Kings. Instead of pursuing Darius immediately, Alexander made a strategic decision. He needed to secure his flank and deny the powerful Persian navy any bases in the Mediterranean. So, he turned south, down the coast of the Levant. This led to the infamous siege of Tyre. Tyre was an island city considered impregnable, but Alexander was nothing if not persistent. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway, connecting the mainland to the island fortress. It took 7 grueling months under constant bombardment, but he eventually breached their defences. The destruction of Tyre was brutal, a stark warning to any who dared resist him. From Tyre he continued into Egypt. The Egyptians, who had long chafed under Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Here, in 381 BC, he founded the city of Alexandria, a vibrant port city that would become a beacon of learning and culture for centuries. He even made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, deep in the desert, where he was reportedly hailed as the son of Amun, a divine endorsement that further fueled his mystique and perhaps his own growing belief in his divine destiny. This is where it gets genuinely interesting for me. How much did Alexander himself truly believe in these pronouncements, and how much was shrewd political manoeuvring? It's a question we still ponder. With his rear secure, Alexander finally turned his full attention back to Darius III. The decisive confrontation came in 333 on the plains of Gaugamela near modern-day Mosul. This was it. The clash of titans, the largest battle of the ancient world. Darius had learned from Issus and chose an open plain, where his cavalry and scythe chariots could operate effectively. He even had the ground level to maximize their impact. His army was truly enormous, perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Alexander, with his roughly 47,000 men, was massively outnumbered. But Alexander was a tactical genius. He deployed his forces in a unique oblique phalanx, tempting Darius to widen his lines, then exploited the gaps. His most audacious move was the Porosor wedge, where he feigned retreat on his left flank, drawing Persian cavalry away, then wheeled his companion cavalry into a massive charge directly at Darius's command post. Again Darius fled, and the Persian army, despite its size, disintegrated. Gaugamela was an absolute masterpiece of military strategy, a victory that effectively ended the Persian Empire as an independent power. It's hard to overstate the scale of this achievement. A small Greek Macedonian force had utterly dismantled the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It's a detail that still blows my mind. After Gaugamela, Alexander marched into the heart of Persia, seizing the great capitals, Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial capital which he famously and controversially burned to the ground. Was it an act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens during the Persian Wars? Was it a drunken whim, or a deliberate symbolic act to signify the complete destruction of the old order? Historians still debate it, but the flames of Persepolis mark the end of an era. With the core of the Persian Empire conquered, Alexander could have stopped. He could have consolidated his vast new territories and ruled from Babylon. But that wasn't Alexander. His ambition knew no bounds. He continued eastward, into what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, Bactria and Sogdiana. This was a brutal, unforgiving campaign, fighting against fierce tribal resistance in a harsh landscape. It was here that he married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, a move that alienated some of his Macedonian generals, but showcased his vision of a fused Greco-Persian empire. His ultimate goal, it seemed, was to reach the ends of the earth and the great outer sea. This led him into India, a land of incredible wealth, exotic animals, and formidable new opponents. In 326 BCE, he faced King Porus and his war elephants at the Hydaspes River. It was one of Alexander's toughest battles, but again, his tactical brilliance prevailed. Yet, the relentless campaigning, the monsoon rains, and the sheer distance from home finally took their toll. His exhausted and homesick troops, reaching the Hephaestus River, refused to go further. They mutinied. This is a profoundly human moment in Alexander's story. The greatest conqueror in history, revered as a god, was stopped not by an enemy army but by the will of his own men. It must have been devastating for him, but he eventually relented. The army began its long, arduous journey home. The return trip was almost as brutal as the conquests. Alexander led a portion of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Balochistan, a hellish landscape of scorching heat and scarce resources. Thousands died of thirst and starvation. It was a terrible miscalculation, a testament to Alexander's hubris perhaps, or his desire to explore the unknown. During this period, his beloved friend and probable lover, Hephaestion, died in Ecbatana, a loss that plunged Alexander into a deep, prolonged grief. Hephaestion's death profoundly affected him, and some historians argue it contributed to his own decline. Back in Babylon, Alexander began planning new campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, perhaps even a circumnavigation of Africa. He was consolidating his empire, integrating Persian nobles into his administration, and encouraging marriages between Macedonians and Persians. He envisioned a truly multicultural empire, a fusion of East and West, a concept revolutionary for its time. But it was not to be. In June 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill in Babylon, possibly from malaria, typhoid, or even poisoning, another enduring mystery. After days of fever, he died at the age of 32. He had ruled for just under 13 years, and in that short time he had carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India, covering over 2 million square miles. His last words, when asked who should inherit his empire, were famously, "to the strongest," and with that he left behind a power vacuum of epic proportions. He had no clear successor, and his generals, the Diadochi successors, immediately began to squabble over the spoils. The vast empire he had forged through unparalleled military genius and sheer force of will would splinter into warring kingdoms, ushering in the Hellenistic age. But Alexander's legacy, the spread of Greek language, culture and ideas across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, was already irrevocably woven into the fabric of history. It was the first faint glimmer of a new dawn, one where Greek influence would spread far beyond the Aegean, shaping civilizations for millennia to come. Alexander the Great, dead at 32. To the strongest. What a mic drop! What an enigma! His empire, spanning 3 continents, stretched from Greece to India, and he left no clear successor. No wonder it immediately shattered. This, my friends, is where we leave the familiar world of the independent polis and step into something grander, messier, and irrevocably changed. The Hellenistic age. The moment Alexander's breath left his body in Babylon, the vultures circled. His generals, those formidable companions who had marched with him to the ends of the known world, immediately began carving up the spoils. We call them the Diadochi, the successors, and their story is a brutal, relentless power struggle that would rage for decades. It's a tale of shifting alliances, betrayals, and massive battles that reshaped the map of the ancient world. They weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for Alexander's legacy, for the very idea of what his empire should become. Initially, there was a pretense of unity. They tried to rule in the name of Alexander's unborn son, Alexander IV, and his half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus. But let's be real, that was never going to last. These were ambitious men, hardened by years of war, and they wanted their own crowns. The first generation of Diadochi, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, were all utterly convinced they were the rightful heir to Alexander's vision, and they were willing to kill anyone who disagreed. By the time the dust settled, after decades of bloody conflict, Alexander's vast empire had fractured into 3 main, enduring Hellenistic kingdoms, along with a smattering of smaller, independent entities. It's a bit like watching a giant jigsaw puzzle fall apart and then reassemble into new, distinct pictures. First, we have the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. This was the realm claimed by Ptolemy I Soter, Alexander's trusted general and friend. He secured Egypt, a land rich in resources and easily defensible, and established a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries, all the way down to the legendary Cleopatra VII. The Ptolemies, though Macedonian Greeks, adopted many Egyptian traditions, even portraying themselves as pharaohs. Alexandria, their capital, became the shining beacon of the Hellenistic world, a true marvel of ancient urban planning and intellectual achievement. Next, stretching across vast swathes of Asia, from Anatolia to India, was the immense Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus Fumudnicata. This was the largest of the successor kingdoms, a sprawling, multi-ethnic entity that struggled with its sheer size and diversity. the Seleucids founded numerous Greek cities throughout their territory, spreading Hellenic culture deep into the Near East. Imagine Greek theatres and gymnasiums popping up in what is now Syria, Iraq, and Iran. This kingdom was a constant struggle to maintain, eventually shrinking under pressure from other powers, including the rising Parthians in the east. Finally, we return to the heartland, Antigonid Macedon. This kingdom was established by Antigonus Phoeus Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed, though it was his grandson Antigonus Tirgonotus who truly solidified the dynasty's control over Macedon and, crucially, over mainland Greece. This meant that for the next century and a half, the very cradle of Greek civilization, the land of the Poleis, was largely under the thumb of Macedonian kings. It wasn't quite the same as the old Persian threat. These were fellow Greeks, but their rule was still an external imposition, a stark reminder that the era of complete city-state independence was largely over. This period, the Hellenistic Age, roughly 33 BC to 1 BCE, ending with the Battle of Actium, is often overlooked in popular narratives, overshadowed by the classical Golden Age or the drama of Alexander. But it's a profound and transformative era, a truly globalized moment where Greek culture, language, and ideas spread far beyond their Aegean origins. This is where it gets genuinely interesting because while the political landscape fragmented, Greek influence actually expanded. Think about it. Alexander's conquests had literally opened up the East. His generals and their successors continued this process, founding hundreds of new cities, all modelled on Greek lines, with Greek institutions like the agora, the gymnasium, and the theatre. This phenomenon, known as Hellenization, meant that for centuries a well-educated person from Egypt, Syria, or even Afghanistan might speak Greek, read Greek philosophy, and appreciate Greek art. Koine Greek, a common dialect, became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, facilitating trade, administration, and cultural exchange. And the intellectual flourishing during this time? It was simply astounding. Alexandria under the Ptolemy became the intellectual capital of the world. Its famous library, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was a beacon of knowledge, attracting scholars from across the Hellenistic world. Imagine a modern research university combined with a national archive all in one place. It was a place where Euclid compiled his Elements of Geometry, where Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, and where scholars meticulously edited and preserved earlier Greek literature. The museum, literally seat of the Muses at Alexandria, was not just a collection of artifacts, but a research institute where the greatest minds of the age studied, debated, and innovated. Philosophy also evolved. While Plato and Aristotle remained foundational, new schools of thought emerged that were more focused on individual happiness and ethics in a complex, uncertain world. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught virtue, reason, and living in harmony with nature, emphasizing resilience and emotional control, a philosophy that would profoundly influence the Romans. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, advocated for a life of modest pleasure, tranquility, and freedom from fear. And then there were the skeptics, who questioned the very possibility of certain knowledge, advising a suspension of judgment for peace of mind. These weren't just abstract ideas, they were practical guides for navigating a world far more expansive and less stable than the old polis. Art and architecture also reflected this new cosmopolitanism. While still fundamentally Greek, Hellenistic art often embraced greater realism, dramatic emotion and dynamic movement. Think of the Laocoon and his sons, or the winged victory of Samothrace. These aren't the calm, idealized forms of classical Greece. They're powerful, expressive, and often monumental. Sculptors weren't afraid to depict old age, suffering, or even the grotesque. And the engineering feats were incredible. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood as a testament to Hellenistic ingenuity. But what about mainland Greece itself? While the great centres of power were now in Alexandria, Antioch and Pergamum, a burgeoning kingdom in Asia Minor, the old police didn't just vanish. They continued to exist, but their political independence was severely curtailed. They were largely under the sway of Antigonid Macedon, or caught in the endless wars between the major Hellenistic powers. Yet even in this diminished state, the spirit of Greek independence flickered. We see the rise of new political entities, the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. These weren't individual city-states, but federations of polis in specific regions of Greece, banding together for mutual defence and to exert greater influence. They were attempts to adapt the old polis model to a world dominated by massive kingdoms. These leagues often found themselves playing a dangerous game, siding with one Hellenistic monarch against another, trying to maintain a precarious balance of power. They fought against Macedon, against each other, and sometimes even against individual member cities. It was a complex, multi-layered political chess game, often bloody and always shifting. While the Greeks of the mainland were squabbling amongst themselves and under the watchful eye of their Macedonian overlords, a new formidable power was steadily rising in the west. We've been so focused on the Aegean and the east, but now, on the Italian peninsula, a republic forged in war and discipline was beginning to cast its shadow. I'm talking, of course, about Rome. Rome had spent centuries consolidating its power in Italy, then engaged in monumental struggles with Carthage for control of the western Mediterranean in the Punic Wars. By the late 3rd century BC, after defeating Hannibal, Rome was the undisputed master of the West, and like any ambitious power, it started looking eastward. The Hellenistic kingdoms, with their vast wealth and internal rivalries, were ripe for intervention. The Romans, with their highly organised legions and relentless political will, initially presented themselves as liberators of the Greek cities from Macedonian tyranny. This is a classic move, right? We're here to help you, they said, and many Greeks, tired of Macedonian dominance, welcomed them. But what the Greeks didn't fully grasp was that Roman help came with a very high price. Eventual Roman control, the Macedonian Wars, began in the late 3rd century BCE. Rome clashed repeatedly with the Antigonid kings, ostensibly to protect Greek freedom, but increasingly to assert their own dominance. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, where the Roman legions, with their flexible manipular tactics, utterly crushed the Macedonian phalanx. It was a symbolic victory representing the triumph of a new military order over the old Hellenistic way of war. Macedon was dismantled, divided into 4 republics, and eventually annexed as a Roman province. But even after Pydna, the Greek leagues and cities still struggled for a semblance of independence, often provoking Rome with their squabbles and insurrections. The Romans, initially somewhat hesitant to directly administer the complex Greek world, eventually ran out of patience. The final brutal act came in 46 BCE, with the Purs sack of Corinth. After an Achaean League revolt, the Roman general Lucius Mummius razed the city, killed its men, and enslaved its women and children. It was a shocking, devastating blow, meant as a clear message to all of Greece: your political independence is over. Greece was then formally organised as a Roman province, Achaea. So by the mid-2nd century BCE, the political independence of the Greek city-states, which had been the defining characteristic of this civilization for nearly 1,000 years, was finally extinguished. The Hellenistic kingdoms in the east would fall one by one over the next century and a half. The Seleucid Empire gradually eroded. Pergamum bequeathed itself to Rome, and finally Ptolemaic Egypt fell with Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, becoming a Roman province. This might sound like the end of our story, the tragic demise of ancient Greece. But that's where the paradox lies. Politically subjugated, militarily defeated, Greece and the Hellenistic world did not simply disappear. Instead, Greek culture, language, philosophy and art became the bedrock of the Roman East. Roman emperors admired and adopted Greek culture, often sending their sons to Athens for education. Greek remained the language of learning, commerce and administration in the eastern half of the Roman Empire for centuries. The Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, but the Greeks, in a very real sense, conquered the Romans culturally. The Hellenistic age, therefore, was not a decline, but a massive transformation. It was the era where Greek identity moved beyond its geographical confines, becoming a global phenomenon that profoundly shaped the world that followed. It laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire, for early Christianity, which spread through a Greek-speaking world, and for the eventual Byzantine Empire. The independent polis may have died, but the Hellenic spirit, like a phoenix, rose from its ashes, spreading its wings across an empire far vaster than even Alexander could have imagined. All right, so we left off with Rome, the new kid on the block, having decisively crushed the Macedonian phalanx, and then, just to really drive the point home, sacked Corinth in 46 BCE. Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, was now officially a Roman province. Fin. The end of ancient Greece, right? Well, not so fast. If you've been with me on this journey, you know that history, especially Greek history, is rarely that simple. It's full of paradoxes, contradictions, and unexpected twists. And this, my friends, is perhaps the biggest paradox of them all. Greece, politically subjugated, became Rome's cultural conqueror. It's a detail that, frankly, still blows my mind. Think about it. Rome, the military juggernaut, the master of engineering and law, empire that would eventually stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, was utterly captivated by Greek culture. The Romans might have defeated the Greeks on the battlefield, but they fell head over heels for Greek philosophy, art, literature, and even their language. It was a cultural absorption on a scale rarely seen in history. The Roman poet Horace famously put it, "Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror," and boy did she ever. For centuries after 146 BCE, Greece, now known as the Roman province of Achaea, with parts also in Macedonia and Epirus, entered a new phase. This wasn't a period of decline and decay in every sense. In many ways it was a time of stability, albeit under foreign rule. The constant, exhausting internecine warfare that had plagued the polis for centuries finally ceased. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought an end to the endless squabbling and devastating conflicts. Roads were built, trade flourished, and cities like Athens, Corinth, and Thessaloniki continued to thrive as cultural and economic centres within the vast Roman Empire. But let's be clear, the glorious political independence of the city-states was gone. The polis, that unique crucible of Greek identity and innovation, was no longer a sovereign entity charting its own destiny. It became a municipality within an empire, its citizens owing allegiance not to their city alone, but to Rome. Roman governors ruled, Roman legions kept order, and Roman law was supreme. the fierce independence that had defined the Athenians or the Spartans, that had driven them to fight to the death against the Persians or each other, was now a historical memory. Yet this didn't mean Greek culture withered. Quite the opposite. The Roman elite, from emperors to senators, eagerly embraced Hellenism. They learned Greek, often considering it the language of culture and intellect, far more refined than Latin. They sent their sons to study philosophy in Athens, collected Greek art, often plundered, yes, but also commissioned, and adopted Greek architectural styles. We see Roman emperors like Augustus and Hadrian, in particular, demonstrating a deep admiration for Greek civilization. Hadrian, a true Philhellene, spent considerable time in Greece, commissioning grand building projects in Athens like the Arch of Hadrian, and completing the Temple of Olympian Zeus, which had stood unfinished for centuries. He even initiated the Panhellenian, a league of Greek cities, attempting to rekindle a sense of shared Greek identity, albeit under Roman patronage. This era saw a fascinating blending of cultures. While Latin was the language of administration and the army in the West, Koine Greek remained the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the language of commerce, education, and everyday life across vast swathes of the Mediterranean and Near East. This linguistic continuity is crucial because it laid the groundwork for future developments. And speaking of developments, we can't talk about Roman Greece without addressing one of the most transformative forces in human history, the rise of Christianity. This new religion, born in the Roman province of Judea, spread rapidly through the Greek-speaking world. The New Testament itself was written primarily in Koine Greek. Early Christian communities flourished in cities like Corinth, Athens, and Thessaloniki, cities to which Paul the Apostle famously wrote his epistles. Initially, Christianity was just one of many cults and philosophies in the diverse religious landscape of the Roman Empire, often persecuted for its refusal to worship the Roman gods and emperors. But it gained traction, particularly among the lower classes and slaves, offering a message of hope, equality, and salvation. As the centuries passed, Christianity grew in influence, gradually challenging and then displacing the ancient pagan traditions that had defined Greek identity for millennia. The Parthenon, once a temple to Athena, would eventually be converted into a Christian church. The Olympic Games, a cornerstone of Greek identity, were finally abolished in 393 CE by Emperor Theodosius V as pagan festivals. It was a slow, often violent, but ultimately decisive shift. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the vast Roman Empire was becoming increasingly unwieldy. Emperor Diocletian first divided it into administrative halves, and then, in 330 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great made the monumental decision to found a new capital for the East, Constantinople, built on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. This act effectively sealed Greece's destiny as part of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire eventually crumbled in 476 CE, succumbing to internal strife and barbarian invasions. But the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years. This empire, often referred to by modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, was distinctly different from its Roman predecessor, yet it was also its direct heir. And here's where Greece and Greek culture truly shone again. The Byzantine Empire was, in essence, a Roman empire that spoke Greek and was Christian. Its emperors still called themselves Romans, but the language of its administration, its intellectual life, and its people was Greek. The classical Greek heritage, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles, was not forgotten. It was preserved, studied, and commented upon by Byzantine scholars, often in monasteries, becoming the foundation upon which Byzantine Christian theology and culture were built. So, while the political independence of the Greek city-states had vanished under Roman rule, the Greek language and cultural legacy not only survived but thrived, becoming the very bedrock of a new, powerful empire that would stand as a bastion of civilization for a millennium. This transition from ancient Greece to Byzantine Greece is a fascinating, complex story of adaptation, transformation, and enduring influence. It demonstrates that even when a civilization's political structure collapses, its intellectual and cultural spirit can continue to shape the world in profound and unexpected ways. This period, from the Roman conquest to the establishment of the Byzantine Empire, truly marks the end of what we traditionally consider ancient Greece. The Hellenistic age had already seen the polis lose much of its political autonomy, and Rome's arrival extinguished it completely. But Greece in its essence never truly died. It simply evolved, adapting to new rulers, new religions, and new imperial structures. The classical legacy, like a mighty river, went underground for a time, only to re-emerge, shaping the contours of the Byzantine world and eventually influencing the Renaissance and the modern world. It's a testament to the sheer power and resilience of Greek ideas, isn't it? Even under the heel of an empire, even as its ancient gods were replaced by a new monotheistic faith, the core elements of Greek thought, its logic, its aesthetics, its drive for knowledge, persisted. And that, in my humble opinion, is a triumph far greater than any military victory. It's the story of how a culture, seemingly defeated, went on to conquer the minds and hearts of its conquerors, ensuring its legacy would endure for centuries to come. We just finished charting the political and military journey of ancient Greece, from its mythical beginnings to its eventual absorption into the Roman and then Byzantine empires. We saw the rise and fall of kings, tyrants and democracies, the clash of empires and the relentless march of time. But here's the thing that absolutely blows my mind. When we talk about the end of ancient Greece, we're really only talking about its political independence. Because in every other way that truly matters, ancient Greece never ended. It simply transformed, diffused, and became an indelible part of the very fabric of Western civilization, and indeed, much of the world. Think about it. We watched the polis system crumble, the Sarissa phalanx dominate, and Alexander's empire fracture. We saw Rome conquer, and then Constantinople rise as the new Greek-speaking heart. But what didn't die? The ideas, the philosophies, the art, the literature, the very way we think about ourselves, our societies, and our place in the cosmos. So much of that began on those sun-drenched shores and rugged islands thousands of years ago. It's a legacy so pervasive, so deeply embedded, that we often don't even recognize it as Greek anymore. It's just us. So, as we embark on this final leg of our journey, I want us to shift our focus from battles and emperors to something far more enduring, the power of ideas. Let's explore the incredible, unconquerable legacy of ancient Greece. Where do we even begin? Perhaps with the bedrock of all human endeavour, thought itself. When we talk about philosophy, we're essentially talking about the Greeks. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these aren't just names in dusty textbooks. They are the intellectual ancestors of virtually every philosophical tradition that followed. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, taught us the importance of self-examination and critical thinking. He showed us that the unexamined life isn't worth living, urging us to constantly challenge assumptions, even our own. This Socratic method, this dialectical pursuit of truth, is still a cornerstone of education and critical inquiry today. Then there's Plato, Socrates' most famous student, who grappled with the nature of reality, justice, and the ideal state. His concept of the forms, perfect eternal archetypes existing beyond our sensory world, deeply influenced Western metaphysics for millennia, from early Christian theology to Renaissance thought. And his Republic, with its exploration of political philosophy, its vision of philosopher kings, and its detailed critique of different forms of government, remains a foundational text for political science. Even if you disagree with his conclusions, the questions he posed are still profoundly relevant. And Aristotle, Aristotle, he was the ultimate polymath, a true intellectual giant whose influence is almost impossible to overstate. He systematized logic, laying the groundwork for scientific reasoning. His work on ethics, particularly the concept of the golden mean, continues to inform our understanding of virtue and character. In biology, he was an empirical pioneer. In physics, his ideas, though later superseded, dominated scientific thought for over 1,000 years. His political treatises analysed various constitutions, providing a framework for understanding governance that still resonates. When we talk about scientific classification, about deductive reasoning, about the very structure of academic inquiry, we're standing on Aristotle's shoulders. It's a detail that honestly blows my mind every time I consider it. But the Greeks didn't just teach us how to think, they taught us how to govern ourselves, or at least how to try. The concept of democracy, rule by the people, emerged in Athens. Now, as we've discussed, Athenian democracy was far from perfect by modern standards. It excluded women, slaves and foreigners, but it was a radical experiment in self-governance. It introduced ideas like citizenship, civic duty, public debate and the rule of law that were revolutionary for their time. Even when later societies didn't adopt direct democracy, the ideal of popular sovereignty, of citizens having a say in their own destiny, found its roots here. The very words we use for political concepts, politics, democracy, tyranny, oligarchy, are Greek. That's not a coincidence. It's a testament to their foundational role in political thought. And what about the way we understand the natural world? The Greeks gave us the first faint glimmer of what we now call science and mathematics. Pythagoras, with his famous theorem, laid the groundwork for geometry. Euclid, with his Elements, created a rigorous axiomatic system of geometry that was the standard textbook for over 2 millennia. Archimedes, the brilliant engineer and mathematician, gave us principles of levers, buoyancy, and calculated pi with astonishing accuracy. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, moved healthcare away from superstition and towards empirical observation, giving us the Hippocratic Oath, still a cornerstone of medical ethics today. These weren't just random discoveries, they were the beginnings of a systematic, rational approach to understanding the universe, a radical deho from myth and magic. Then there's the sheer power and beauty of their literature and drama. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, didn't just tell thrilling stories of heroes and gods. They shaped Greek identity, provided moral instruction, and established narrative conventions that are still with us. They are quite simply masterpieces of world literature. And Greek drama. The invention of tragedy and comedy, performed in open-air theatres, was a profound innovation. Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides explored universal themes of fate, free will, justice and human suffering in ways that still resonate with audiences today. Think about Oedipus, Antigone, Medea. These characters and their struggles are timeless. Aristophanes, with his biting political and social satire, showed us the power of comedy to critique and provoke. The very structure of plays, the concepts of chorus, protagonist and antagonist, they all started here. And visually, the impact is just as profound. Greek art and architecture, defined an aesthetic ideal that has been revisited and reinterpreted countless times. The elegant simplicity of the Doric order, the graceful volutes of the Ionic, the ornate capitals of the Corinthian, these classical orders became the vocabulary of Western architecture, from the Roman Pantheon to the US Capitol building. Greek sculpture, with its idolized human forms, its pursuit of beauty, balance, and naturalism, set a standard that artists would strive for centuries. The Parthenon, even in ruins, is still a breathtaking testament to their genius for proportion and harmony. So how did all these incredible ideas, these forms of expression, this way of thinking survive and spread? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting. It wasn't a straight line, but a complex, fascinating journey across cultures and centuries. First, the Romans. They conquered Greece militarily, yes, but culturally they were conquered by Greece. Roman elites admired Greek philosophy, art, and literature. They studied Greek, they hired Greek tutors, and they adopted Greek architectural styles. The Romans became the great preservers and disseminators of Greek culture throughout their vast empire. They translated Greek texts, copied Greek statues, and incorporated Greek ideas into their own legal and political systems. Horace famously said, "Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror," and it's true. Then, as the Western Roman Empire declined, the torch was passed to the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople. This was a Greek-speaking empire, and its scholars meticulously preserved and copied countless classical Greek manuscripts. While Western Europe entered its dark ages, the Byzantines were diligently studying Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and the Greek tragedians. They were the librarians and custodians of this immense intellectual heritage, safeguarding it through centuries of upheaval. Crucially, this wasn't just a Western story. The Islamic Golden Age, beginning in the 8th century CE, played an absolutely vital role in the transmission of Greek knowledge. Muslim scholars, driven by a thirst for knowledge, translated massive numbers of Greek texts, especially in philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, into Arabic. They didn't just translate, they studied, commented on, critiqued, and built upon these Greek foundations, making their own significant advances. Think of Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Khwarizmi. They were deeply engaged with Greek thought. These Arabic translations, particularly of Aristotle, were then reintroduced to Western Europe through places like Islamic Spain and Sicily, sparking an intellectual revolution. This reintroduction was a key catalyst for the Renaissance in Europe. Renaissance literally means rebirth, and what was being reborn? The classical ideals, the art, the literature, and the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Scholars flocked to Constantinople before its fall in 1453, bringing precious Greek manuscripts back to Italy. The invention of the printing press further democratized access to these texts. Suddenly, Europe was rediscovering a vast intellectual treasure trove that had been largely lost or forgotten in the West for 1,000 years. This led to a flourishing of art, science, and humanism, fundamentally reshaping European thought. And the influence didn't stop there. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries drew heavily on Greek rationalism and political philosophy. The American and French revolutions, with their emphasis on democracy, citizenship, and individual rights, echoed the ideals first articulated in the Athenian polis. Our modern scientific method, with its emphasis on observation, hypothesis, and logical deduction, owes a profound debt to the intellectual rigour pioneered by the Greeks. Even our educational systems, from the liberal arts curriculum to the very structure of universities, bear the imprint of Greek learning. So when we look around us today, we see ancient Greece everywhere. When we discuss ethics or justice, we're engaging with Plato and Aristotle. When we go to the theatre or watch a movie, we're experiencing narrative structures perfected by Aeschylus and Sophocles. When we admire a neoclassical building, we're seeing the enduring beauty of Doric columns. When we participate in a democracy, however imperfect, we're living out an experiment that began in Athens. The story of ancient Greece isn't just a closed chapter in history. It's an ongoing conversation, a living tradition that continues to shape our world. It's a testament to the extraordinary power of human ingenuity, curiosity, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge and beauty. From the wine-dark sea to the farthest reaches of human thought, the echoes of Olympus still resonate. And that, my friends, is a legacy truly worthy of wonder. If you've enjoyed this journey through the entire history of ancient Greece, from its mysterious Bronze Age roots to its enduring influence on modernity, then you've truly understood something profound, that history isn't just about what happened, but about how what happened continues to define who we are. We left off with the Byzantine Empire, that incredible inheritor of Rome's eastern mantle, meticulously safeguarding the intellectual flame of ancient Greece through 1,000 years of medieval darkness in Western Europe. It was a Greek-speaking Christian empire, a living library, a cultural vault that kept the works of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Euclid, and Hippocrates from being lost to the ages. But even the mightiest empires eventually wane, and Byzantium, though resilient, was no exception. Imagine for a moment the sheer weight of history on Constantinople's shoulders. For centuries it stood as a bulwark against encroaching empires, a beacon of learning and culture. Yet it was slowly, inexorably weakening. The Crusades, initially conceived as holy wars against the Seljuk Turks, ironically dealt some of the most grievous blows. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, a truly mind-boggling betrayal, saw Western European crusaders sack Constantinople itself, plundering its treasures, burning its libraries, and utterly devastating the city. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a profound cultural wound, a schism that never truly healed, and a catastrophic loss of invaluable texts and artifacts. It's one of those historical moments that, when you dig into it, just makes no sense in the context of its stated goals. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaimed their capital, the empire was a shadow of its former self, fragmented and vulnerable. The final act came in 1453, when the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II breached Constantinople's formidable walls. The fall of the city was not just the end of an empire, it was for many the symbolic end of the ancient world. But here's the paradox, the beautiful twist in the narrative. This end was also a beginning. As the Ottoman threat loomed large over Constantinople in the preceding decades and centuries, Byzantine scholars, fearing for their lives and their precious manuscripts, began to flee westward, carrying with them armfuls of ancient Greek texts that had been forgotten or simply never known in Latin-speaking Europe. Think of them as intellectual refugees, unwittingly planting the seeds of a revolution. They brought with them not just the physical scrolls, but the knowledge of how to read and interpret them, a living connection to a forgotten past. But before we leap to the Renaissance, let's pause for a crucial acknowledgement, a detail that often gets overlooked in the Western-centric view of history, the indispensable role of the Islamic Golden Age. While Europe was largely in its dark ages, Islamic scholars, from the 8th century onward, were actively translating and studying Greek works. In bustling centres like Baghdad, Damascus, and later Cordoba, They weren't just preserving these texts, they were engaging with them, critiquing them, and building upon them. Think of luminaries like Avicenna and Averroes, who meticulously studied Aristotle, adding their own brilliant commentaries. They were the intellectual bridge builders, ensuring that Greek philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy were not just kept alive, but actively advanced. When these translated Arabic texts, along with the original Greek ones, eventually made their way into Europe, often through the vibrant multicultural centres of Sicily and Islamic Spain, they were like a shockwave. And what a shockwave it was! This influx of Greek thought, both directly from Byzantium and indirectly through the Islamic world, ignited what we now call the Renaissance, the rebirth of Europe. Suddenly, after centuries of focusing primarily on theological interpretations of the world, Western thinkers rediscovered the profound humanism, rational inquiry, and artistic excellence of the ancients. It wasn't just a stylistic shift, it was a fundamental change in how people viewed themselves and their place in the cosmos. Imagine a world where the works of Plato and Aristotle were suddenly available again in their original forms, or in brilliant new Latin translations. Scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus devoured them, sparking the humanist movement, which emphasized human potential and achievement, individual dignity, and the importance of a well-rounded education rooted in classical studies. This was a radical departure, a bold affirmation of the human experience, echoing the very spirit of the ancient Greeks. The impact was immediate and transformative. In art, we see a return to the classical ideals of beauty, proportion, and naturalism, evident in the sculptures of Michelangelo and the paintings of Raphael, which drew heavily on Greek sculptural forms and mythological themes. Architecture, too, rediscovered the classical orders, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns that had graced the Parthenon and other Greek temples. Think of the grand domes and symmetrical facades of Renaissance buildings. They are direct descendants of Greek and Roman principles. But the Renaissance was just the opening act. The seeds sown by the rediscovery of Greek thought blossomed further into the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The Greek emphasis on observation, logic, and rational inquiry, pioneered by figures like Thales, Pythagoras, and Aristotle, even if some of his specific scientific conclusions were later disproven, his method was revolutionary, provided a crucial intellectual framework. Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, while charting new scientific frontiers, were standing on the shoulders of Greek mathematicians and astronomers. The very idea that the universe could be understood through reason and systematic investigation is a profoundly Greek legacy. Then we come to the Enlightenment, that pivotal 18th century movement that fundamentally reshaped Western political thought. Where did the Enlightenment thinkers, the architects of modern democracy, turn for inspiration? To ancient Greece, of course. They saw in Athenian democracy, despite its limitations, the first practical example of self-governance, the idea that citizens could actively participate in shaping their own destiny. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu wrestled with the same fundamental questions that Plato and Aristotle had debated centuries earlier. What is justice? What is the best form of government? What are the rights and responsibilities of citizens? The concepts of natural rights, the social contract, and the separation of powers, while refined and expanded by Enlightenment thinkers, have clear roots in Greek political philosophy and the struggles of the polis to define themselves. The very language we use for these concepts, democracy, politics, tyranny, oligarchy, is Greek. This brings us to the present day, to our own lives, right here, right now. The entire history of ancient Greece might seem like a distant echo, but its reverberations are everywhere. Think about it. Our political systems. We still grapple with the ideals of democracy, citizenship, and the rule of law, all concepts forged in the Greek crucible. Our debates about representation, freedom of speech, and civic duty are direct descendants of the Athenian agora. Our philosophy. Every major philosophical question, from ethics to metaphysics, has its origins in the inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We are still, in many ways, having conversations they started. Our science and medicine. The commitment to empirical observation, logical deduction, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. This is a Greek gift. From the Hippocratic Oath to the geometric theorems we learn in school, the scientific method traces its lineage back to the Hellenic world. Our literature and drama. The very genres of tragedy, comedy, epic poetry, and history writing were invented by the Greeks. Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Herodotus, Thucydides, their works remain foundational. Their storytelling techniques and dramatic structures still influence writers and filmmakers today. Our art and architecture. Look at government buildings, museums, or even banks in any major Western city, and you'll likely see classical columns, pediments, and symmetrical designs, a direct homage to Greek temples. The ideals of beauty, harmony, and proportion that define Western aesthetics were largely set by the Greeks. Our language. English is peppered with thousands of words of Greek origin. Democracy, philosophy, physics, biology, mathematics, theatre, gymnasium, stadium, economy, irony, chaos, cosmos, eureka. The list is endless. Our sports. The Olympic Games, a symbol of international unity and athletic excellence, were revived in the modern era as a direct tribute to their ancient Greek predecessors. So when we talk about the entire history of ancient Greece, we're not just talking about dusty scrolls or crumbling ruins. We're talking about the very bedrock of Western civilization. It's a history that didn't truly end with the fall of Corinth to Rome, or even with the fall of Constantinople. It continued, transformed, adapted, and spread, like a powerful river carving new channels through the landscape of human thought. The paradox endures, a collection of fiercely independent, often squabbling city-states whose political unity was fleeting and whose direct political power eventually vanished, managed to create a cultural and intellectual legacy so profound, so enduring, that it continues to define us. It's a testament to the power of ideas, to the human spirit's insatiable curiosity, and to the timeless questions that were first articulated on the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean. From the first faint glimmer of Minoan civilization to the globalized world we inhabit today, the story of ancient Greece is, in a very real sense, still being written, still unfolding in every act of democratic participation, every scientific discovery, every work of art, and every philosophical inquiry. It's a legacy that truly blows my mind, and one that I hope you now see as profoundly, beautifully, and eternally alive. We've journeyed through millennia, haven't we? From the enigmatic Minoans crafting their frescoes in sun-drenched palaces, through the formidable Mycenaean citadels, the quiet darkness of the Iron Age, the vibrant rebirth of the Polis, the epic struggles against Persia, the dazzling brilliance of Athens' Golden Age, the brutal exhaustion of the Peloponnesian War, the rise of Macedon, and Alexander's whirlwind conquest that painted the known world Hellenistic. We've seen empires rise and fall, ideas ignite and spread, and a culture born in a small rocky peninsula become the intellectual bedrock for half the globe. But if you've been with us this whole time, if you've been listening, you'll know that the story of ancient Greece doesn't truly end with the Roman conquest, or even with the final dissolution of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Oh no, that's just where the political narrative concludes. The real story, the one that makes ancient Greece so profoundly important, is its enduring legacy. It's the constant echo of those ancient voices, those revolutionary ideas, those breathtaking artistic achievements that reverberate through our world even today. This is the ultimate paradox we started with, remember? How could a culture so politically disunited, so often at each other's throats, manage to produce such a coherent and enduring impact? Let's unpack some of these echoes, shall we? Because this isn't just dusty history, it's the very air we breathe in our modern world. The unshakable pillars of thought, philosophy's journey. Think about philosophy. When I say philosophy, who comes to mind? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, right? These weren't just thinkers, they were intellectual titans whose ideas literally shaped how we understand reality, ethics, politics, and knowledge itself. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, laid the groundwork for critical thinking. Plato, his student, envisioned ideal societies and explored the nature of truth and reality through his theory of forms, a concept that still sparks debate among philosophers today. And then there's Aristotle, the polymath, who systematized logic, biology, physics, ethics, and politics, influencing Western thought for nearly 2 millennia. Their ideas didn't just vanish when Rome took over. Far from it. Roman Stoicism, for example, drew heavily from Greek philosophical traditions, offering a practical guide for living in a chaotic world. Later, in the Byzantine Empire, Greek texts were meticulously preserved and copied, often in monasteries, becoming invaluable repositories of ancient wisdom. But here's a detail that often gets overlooked: the Islamic Golden Age. During a period when much of Western Europe was in intellectual slumber, Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes didn't just translate Greek works. They engaged with their, critiqued them, and built upon them, making their own profound contributions to medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. This intellectual bridge was absolutely crucial. Without these Arabic translations and commentaries, many Greek texts might have been lost to the West forever. Then came the Renaissance in Europe, a rebirth precisely because it rediscovered these Greek and Roman classics, often through those very Arabic translations. Suddenly Europe was re-exposed to Plato's idealism, Aristotle's logic, and the Socratic method. This wasn't just a quaint academic exercise. It ignited new ways of thinking about humanity, science, and the state, laying the intellectual groundwork for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Every time we engage in critical thinking, every time we question assumptions, every time we try to understand the nature of justice or the good life, we are walking in the footsteps of those ancient Greeks. It's truly mind-blowing, isn't it? The radical experiment. Democracy's enduring flame. And what about politics? We talked about the Athenian experiment with democracy, demos kratos, rule by the people. Now let's be clear. Athenian democracy wasn't perfect. It was limited to adult male citizens, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. But the idea itself was revolutionary. The notion that citizens could govern themselves, participate in decision-making, and hold their leaders accountable, that was a radical departure from kings, tyrants, and oligarchs. Even after Athens' democratic flame flickered out, the concept of self-governance, of a citizenry having a voice, never truly died. It was studied, debated, and reinterpreted. Thinkers of the Enlightenment, like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu, pored over Greek political philosophy. They drew inspiration from Athens when formulating their own theories about natural rights, the social contract, and the separation of powers. When the American founding fathers drafted the Constitution, they weren't just inventing something new, they were consciously engaging with a tradition that stretched back to Solon and Cleisthenes. They adapted Greek ideas to a new context, creating a representative republic rather than a direct democracy. But the core principles of citizen participation, rule of law, and a government accountable to its people, those were forged in the crucible of ancient Athenian thought. So when you vote, when you debate public policy, when you demand accountability from your elected officials, you are, in a very real sense, participating in a conversation that began over 2,500 years ago in the Athenian agora. That's not just history, that's living legacy. The quest for knowledge, science, math, and medicine. Let's shift gears to science and mathematics. Before the Greeks, explanations for the world were largely mythological. If the crops failed, it was angry gods. If someone got sick, it was a curse. The Greeks, however, started asking why in a different way. They began to seek rational, observable explanations. Think of Pythagoras and his theorem, which still forms the basis of geometry. Euclid's Elements codified geometry in a way that was unsurpassed for centuries. Eratosthenes accurately calculated the Earth's circumference using simple shadows and geometry, a detail that still blows my mind every time I think about it. Archimedes, with his insights into physics and engineering, was a true genius whose principles of levers and buoyancy are fundamental to science today. And in medicine we have Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. He moved away from supernatural explanations for illness, advocating for observation, diagnosis, and ethical practice. The Hippocratic Oath, with its commitment to do no harm, is still a cornerstone of medical ethics worldwide. Like philosophy, these scientific and mathematical advancements were preserved and expanded by Byzantine and, critically, Islamic scholars. Al-Khwarizmi, for instance, built on Greek mathematics, introducing algebra to the world. These preserved and enhanced ideas eventually made their way back to Europe, fueling the scientific revolution. The very spirit of rational inquiry, the belief that the universe operates according to discoverable laws, and the scientific method itself, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, all have deep roots in ancient Greece. When we look up at the stars, when we solve an equation, when we seek a diagnosis, we are tapping into a tradition of intellectual curiosity that the Greeks pioneered. The beauty that endures, art, architecture, and literature. Finally, let's talk about the sheer aesthetic impact. Greek art and architecture set standards of beauty, proportion, and harmony that have resonated for millennia. The Parthenon, with its perfect proportions and subtle optical illusions, remains an architectural marvel. Greek sculpture, evolving from rigid archaic forms to the dynamic realism of the classical period, influenced Roman art and became the benchmark for beauty during the Renaissance and beyond. Neoclassical movements across Europe and America, from the White House to countless public buildings, consciously echoed Greek temple design, symbolizing ideals of democracy and civic virtue. And literature, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, aren't just great stories. They are foundational texts that explore universal themes of heroism, fate, identity, and suffering. Greek tragedy, with playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, delved into the deepest questions of human existence, morality, and the human condition. Comedy, too, with Aristophanes, offered sharp political satire and social commentary. These forms, these narrative structures, these archetypes still inform our storytelling, our theatre, and our understanding of human drama today. Every time you watch a play, read a novel with a heroic journey, or see a building with columns, you are experiencing the direct descendants of Greek artistic innovation. The ultimate paradox. Why Greece? So how did this happen? How did a collection of fiercely independent, often squabbling villages and city-states manage to create such a unified, profound, and enduring legacy? This is the paradox, isn't it? Perhaps it was precisely that fragmentation, that intense competition, the agon that drove them. Each polis striving for excellence, not just in war, but in art, philosophy, and governance. The constant debate, the public discourse, the freedom, at least for some, to question and innovate. They didn't have a centralized empire dictating culture, like Egypt or Persia. Instead, culture emerged from a vibrant, often contentious marketplace of ideas. The shared language, the pan-Hellenic games, the common mythology, and the challenges they faced together, like the Persians, fostered a sense of shared identity, a Greekness that transcended their political divisions. And within that shared framework, individual genius flourished, unchecked by rigid dogma, always pushing the boundaries of what was known and what was possible. An ever-living legacy. Ancient Greece isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a living, breathing part of who we are. It's in the words we use: democracy, philosophy, logic, ethics, history, and theatre. And it's in the way we think about justice, citizenship, and the pursuit of knowledge. It's in the beauty we find in balance and proportion, and the stories we tell about heroes and human struggles. This journey, from the earliest Bronze Age whispers to the echoes that resonate in our modern world, has been a testament to the incredible power of human creativity, curiosity, and resilience. The Greeks, in their relatively brief period of political ascendancy, asked the fundamental questions, developed the foundational concepts, and created the aesthetic benchmarks that have shaped Western civilization. Their legacy is not merely preserved, it is continually reinterpreted, debated, and built upon, proving that the greatest ideas, like the mightiest rivers, always find a way to flow on, carving new paths and nourishing new landscapes long after their source has seemingly run dry. So as we bring our grand tour of ancient Greece to a close, remember this: the story isn't over. It lives on in every library, every courtroom, every classroom, every theatre, and every moment we pause to think, to question, to create. It lives on because ancient Greece, in all its paradox and brilliance, taught us how to truly live, how to truly think, and how to truly build a world. And that, my friends, is why it still matters, and why it always will.